The world you think you know rests on foundations that were laid long before anyone bothered to write anything down. And the deeper you dig into the forgotten corners of American history, the more you realize that someone went to extraordinary lengths to make sure certain things stayed forgotten. This is not a story about ghosts or legends, or the kind of tale that grandmothers tell children to keep them from wandering too far into the woods. This is a story about a real boy who walked out of a real forest in 1915 and described something so disturbing that 3 grown men who had seen death and violence and every kind of human cruelty the frontier could offer, refused to write down what he told them in full. And what fragments did survive were locked away, sealed in a drawer, and left to rot for more than 100 years, as if the paper itself was dangerous, as if the words on those pages could infect anyone who read them with the same quiet terror that followed the boy out of the trees. The autumn of 1915 was cold and wet in the Missouri Ozarks, the kind of season that turns the logging roads into rivers of mud and keeps sensible people close to their fires. The leaves had turned weeks early that year, and the old-timers said it meant a hard winter was coming, the kind that killed livestock and sometimes killed people who were not prepared for it. The county was small and poor, stitched together by those muddy logging roads and a handful of families who had lived there so long they had forgotten there was anywhere else to live. The nearest real town was a full day's ride on a good horse, and most people in that valley had never made the trip more than a handful of times in their entire lives. They were born within 20 miles of where they would die, and they knew every face within those 20 miles the way a person knows the rooms of their own house. So when a boy appeared one autumn morning who did not belong to any of those faces, it was not just unusual. It was impossible. His name was never recorded, not because no one asked, but because he would not give it. He was maybe 10 years old, though he was small enough that he could have been 8 or large enough that he could have been 12, and the hunger in his face made it difficult to tell. He had no shoes. His feet were torn and bloody from walking over ground that was not kind to bare skin. His clothes were made from a fabric that the local women who had spun their own thread and woven their own cloth their entire lives, said they had never seen before. It was not wool. It was not cotton. It was not linen. They could not even agree on what it felt like, only that it was wrong, that it did not belong in their valley any more than the boy himself belonged there. He sat in the middle of a field that belonged to a farmer named Harlan, soaked through from the night's rain, shaking with cold but not crying, not calling out, just sitting there as if he had been placed in that exact spot and told to wait. Harlan found him at first light when he walked out to check on the fence line that the deer had been breaking through all season. He stopped dead when he saw the shape in the mist, because his first thought was not that it was a child. His first thought was that something had died in his field overnight, some animal too tired or too sick to make it any further. But then the shape moved, and Harlan saw that it was a boy, and the cold feeling that settled into his chest in that moment never quite left him for the rest of his life. Harlan had lived in that valley since before he could remember. His father had built the house he still slept in, and his grandfather had cleared the land that house stood on. He had buried neighbors with his own hands, lowering men and women he had known since childhood into holes he had dug himself. He had pulled calves from dying mothers in the middle of blizzards, the blood freezing on his arms before he could wipe it off. He had dug wells by hand, hauling up buckets of mud for weeks until he hit water. Nothing about the hard country surprised him anymore, or at least that was what he had believed until that morning. Because a strange child appearing overnight in clothes no store within 100 miles had ever sold, sitting in a field that Harlan had walked 1,000 times, put a feeling in him that he could not name. It was not fear exactly. It was something older than fear, something that lived in the part of the brain that had learned a long time ago to recognize when something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. The boy did not cry when Harlan approached. He did not run. He watched Harlan the way a wild animal watches a man it has decided not to fear yet, not because it trusts the man, but because it is still calculating whether the man is a threat worth running from. When Harlan spoke to him, the boy answered in English, but slowly, carefully, like a person choosing from words he had not used in a long time, like a person who knew the language but had not practiced it in months or maybe years. Harlan asked him where he came from. The boy pointed at the ridge line to the north, at the dark wall of trees that marked the edge of the deep timber, the part of the forest that even the loggers rarely entered because the terrain was too rough, and the trees were too far from any road to make cutting them worthwhile. He said one word when he pointed, and that word was others. Not a family, not a settlement, not hunters or trappers or any of the other explanations that might have made sense in that place at that time. The others. As if he was drawing a distinction between himself and everyone else in the world, between the people who lived behind that tree line and the people who lived in front of it. Harlan asked him what he meant by that, and the boy said something that should have been nonsense. He said it was not there anymore. He said they took it down. A hungry child says strange things. Harlan knew that. He had seen children babble from fever, from exhaustion, from the kind of fear that scrambles the mind and makes words come out in the wrong order. He told himself that the boy had simply been lost in the woods too long, that hunger and cold had confused him, that whatever he was talking about was the product of a child's imagination trying to make sense of a terrifying experience. So he wrapped the boy in a horse blanket, lifted him onto the wagon, and drove him into town to the sheriff, a heavy-set man named Coyle who had held the office for 19 years and had, in his own words, heard every lie a frightened person can tell. The town was not much of a town by any standard that people from cities would recognize. It was a handful of buildings clustered around a crossroads, a general store and a church, and a small wooden structure that served as both the sheriff's office and the county courthouse. The people there did not have much, but they knew each other, and they helped each other. And when Harlan came riding in with a strange boy wrapped in a blanket, word spread through the town before the wagon had even stopped. Coyle came out of his office and looked at the boy with the flat, evaluating gaze of a man who has seen too much to be surprised by anything. He had dealt with runaways before, children fleeing beatings or worse, children whose parents had died and left them with nowhere to go. He had dealt with the survivors of cabin fires and floods, and all the other ways the country found to kill people who were not careful. He expected the boy to be one of those things, a simple tragedy that would resolve itself in a simple way, with a grave or a placement with a family willing to take in another mouth to feed. That is not what he got. They brought the boy inside and sat him by the stove to warm him, and someone brought food, bread and salt pork, and a cup of milk that the boy drank so fast he almost choked on it. He ate like he had not eaten in a week, cramming food into his mouth with both hands, and the adults in the room watched him with the kind of pity that people feel when they see suffering they cannot immediately explain. But then the eating slowed, and the boy looked up at the faces around him, and he began to talk. He did not talk the way children usually talk, the way they jump from subject to subject and lose their thread and need adults to guide them back to the point. He talked steadily, methodically, as if he was describing a place he wanted the adults to be able to find if they went looking for it. And the more he talked, the quieter the room got. Because he was not describing a cabin. He was not describing a farm or a settlement or any of the rough structures that people in that part of the country built to shelter themselves from the weather. He was describing something else entirely. Coyle stopped him there and asked how a child could invent such a thing. How could a barefoot boy from the hills describe technology that did not exist anywhere in the region, describe architecture that no one in that county had ever seen, describe a place that sounded like nothing anyone in that room had ever heard of? The boy did not understand the question. He looked at Coyle with genuine confusion, as if Coyle had asked him how he could invent the concept of a tree or a river or the sky. To the boy, what he was describing was not a wonder. It was not something extraordinary or impossible. It was simply how things worked where he came from. The lights came on because that was what lights did. The buildings were tall because buildings were tall. The streets were straight because streets were straight. And that certainty, more than the story itself, unsettled the men listening. A child making up a story would have been excited about it, would have embellished it, would have grown uncomfortable when pressed for details. This boy described miracles the way other children described their breakfast, with the flat confidence of someone stating simple facts about the world as he knew it. Coyle asked him where this place was, this city of tall stone buildings and lights that burned without fuel. The boy said it was right here. It was all around them. It was under the trees. He said most of it had been pulled down and carried away before he was born, but that some of it had stayed, hidden in the places where the forest was thickest and the terrain was roughest, the places where outsiders did not go. And he said that some of the people had stayed, too, living in what was left, keeping to themselves, surviving on what they could grow and hunt in the shadows of ruins that had once been something magnificent. The others. That was who the others were. Not ghosts. Not spirits. Not the creatures of legend that parents used to frighten children into obedience. Just people, living in the remains of a place that the rest of the world had been told never existed. Coyle wrote some of this down. We know that because the pages exist, locked away in that drawer for 100 years, written in the careful hand of a man who was not sure whether he should believe what he was hearing, but could not quite make himself stop listening. He wrote down the description of the buildings. He wrote down the description of the lights. He wrote down the boy's claim that the city had been deliberately dismantled, not abandoned, not destroyed by war or disaster, but taken apart piece by people who wanted it gone. And then, on the second day, the boy said the thing that made Coyle stop writing. He said the men who took it apart were still working. He said it was not finished. He said the tearing down had been going on his entire life, that crews came in the night and pulled down what was left, that they broke the stone and hauled it away on the raised roads that still ran through the forest like the bones of something dead. And he said the people were being taken, too. The ones who had stayed behind, the others who lived in the ruins, were being removed quietly, a few at a time. Covered wagons came at night, and people got into them, and the wagons drove north, and no one ever saw those people again. No one ever heard from them. They simply ceased to exist, as if they had been erased from the world along with the buildings they had called home. The boy said he had watched it happen to his own people. He said the old woman who had raised him, the closest thing he had to a mother, had woken him in the middle of the night and told him to run. She had pointed south and told him not to stop, not to look back, not to speak of the tall buildings to anyone, ever. She had said the men who came for people followed talk. If he talked, they would find him. And then she had gone out to meet the wagons, and he had run, and he had kept running until he came out of the trees and collapsed in Harlan's field with nothing left in him but the story he had been told never to tell. He told it anyway. He told it to the first grown man who would listen. He broke the old woman's only rule before her body was even cold, if she was even dead, if she had not simply been loaded into a wagon and driven away to whatever fate waited for the people who remembered the tall buildings and the lights that did not need oil. Coyle sat with this for a long moment. The room was silent except for the crackle of the fire in the stove. Every man there was thinking the same thing, which was that this could not possibly be true, that a child could not possibly be describing what he seemed to be describing, that there had to be some explanation that made sense. But none of them could find one. Because the boy was not describing magic. He was not describing ghosts or spirits or any of the supernatural phenomena that ghost stories trade in. He was describing something far more disturbing. He was describing demolition. He was describing crews of men with tools, pulling down structures in an organized fashion and hauling the materials away. He was describing paperwork and wagons and the calm, methodical process of erasing a place from existence. That kind of erasure does not happen by accident. That kind of erasure happens because someone decided it should happen, because someone with power and resources looked at a place and its people and made the decision that they should no longer exist. And the boy was saying it was still happening, right then, in the woods just north of where they were sitting. Coyle asked him to describe the men who came for people, the ones who drove the wagons and pulled down the buildings. The boy called them the ones in gray. He said they wore long gray coats, the kind that went down past the knee and had many pockets. He said they did not look like farmers or soldiers or any of the working men he had seen in his life. They carried themselves differently, he said, as if they were not used to physical labor, as if their work was done with words and papers rather than hands and tools. And papers, he said, always papers. The ones in gray came with documents. They would arrive at a place, show their papers, and then whatever they had come for stopped existing. A building would be torn down. A family would be loaded into a wagon. A name would be scratched out of whatever record had held it. The papers made it allowed, the boy said. He did not understand exactly how it worked, but he understood the pattern. Once the ones in gray had the right papers, no one could stop them. They showed the documents, and then the crews came, and then whatever had been there before was gone, and the papers were the only proof it had ever existed. And the ones in gray took the papers with them, so there was nothing left to point to. No building, no people, no record except the one they carried away. Coyle asked him why. Why would anyone go to such lengths to destroy buildings and remove people from a place no one else seemed to know about? The boy said he did not know why. He only knew that it happened, that it had been happening for longer than he had been alive, that the old people remembered when the city was still standing and remembered when the first crews came to tear it down. They had been told it was for their own good, at first. They had been told the old buildings were dangerous, that they would fall on their own if they were not taken apart carefully. But then the wagons started coming for people, and the story stopped making sense, because buildings fall down but people do not, and yet the people were disappearing just as surely as the stone. He said his settlement, what was left of it, was taken down over 3 nights. The crews worked in the dark, by lights they brought with them, and the sound of stone being broken echoed through the forest until dawn. By the 3rd night, there was almost nothing left, just rubble and raw earth where tall walls had stood. And on the 3rd night, the wagons came for the people. The old woman had seen the lights through the trees. She had known what was coming, and instead of waiting to be loaded onto a wagon like everyone else, she had woken the boy and told him to run, told him to go south, and keep going until he came out of the forest on the other side, told him to find people who did not know about the tall buildings and live among them and never, ever talk about where he had come from. He had run. He had run through the dark, tripping over roots and rocks, tearing his feet open on the rough ground, listening to the sound of the wagons and the shouts of the men and the quieter sounds of people who were not fighting back because there was nothing to fight back with. He had run until there was no sound behind him but the wind in the trees. He had kept running until the trees ended, and he stumbled into an open field, and his body simply gave out, too exhausted to take another step. And then he had waited, because he did not know what else to do. And eventually a man named Harlan had found him sitting in the mist, wrapped in a horse blanket that smelled like sweat and leather, and brought him to a town that did not know his name and could not understand where he had come from. Now, a modern person wants to stop right here and say that this is clearly a frightened child inventing a story. Children invent stories all the time. They confuse dreams with reality. They take fragments of things they have heard and reassemble them into narratives that feel true but are not. A hungry, traumatized boy from the backwoods could easily have hallucinated buildings and lights and men in gray coats. The human mind does strange things under stress, and children's minds do even stranger things. That is the reasonable explanation. That is the explanation that lets you close the book and go about your day and not think about what it would mean if the boy was telling the truth. But Coyle did something in the week that followed the boy's arrival that tells us he did not think it was only a story. He did not dismiss what he had heard. He did not file the boy's account under childhood fantasy and move on to more pressing matters. Instead, he started asking questions. He started with the people he knew, the old-timers who had lived in the valley their whole lives and might remember something that could explain what the boy was talking about. He asked about the forest to the north, about the deep timber where no one went, about whether anyone had ever seen anything strange in those woods. And the answers he got were not reassuring, because it turned out that the boy was not the first person to tell strange stories about that part of the forest. Over the previous decade, more than one traveler had passed through the county and mentioned seeing things in the northern woods that did not make sense. One man, a surveyor who had been hired to map the region for a timber company, had told people in town that he had found stone roads in the forest, roads that ran straight as arrows for miles and then simply vanished, as if they had been buried or swallowed by the ground. He had measured one of the roads. It ran for nearly 4 miles without deviating from its line by more than a few inches. No crew he knew of could have laid such a road. No equipment he was aware of could have achieved that precision in terrain that rough. And the road was old, far older than any settler structure he had ever seen. The trees growing over it were ancient, their roots wrapped around the stones as if they had been there for centuries. He had written the word ancient in his notebook, and then in the margin he had added a second word, deliberate. Because roads do not happen by accident. Roads are built by people, for people, to connect places that people want to travel between. A road 4 miles long, running straight through rough terrain, is not a natural formation. It is not a geological curiosity. It is evidence that someone was here before the settlers, someone with the knowledge and the labor to build infrastructure that the settlers themselves could not have replicated. And the surveyor was not the only one. Preachers who traveled through the region had reported similar things. They had found stone foundations in the middle of untouched forest, foundations laid out in patterns that made no sense for farmhouses or hunting cabins. They had found low stone walls arranged in shapes that followed no property line and enclosed nothing useful, walls that seemed to mark boundaries for something that was no longer there. They had found cleared areas in the deep woods where trees refused to grow, bare patches of earth that local people called dead spots, and avoided without quite being able to say why. One preacher wrote in a letter that he had felt watched in those places. Not by animals, not by people he could see, just watched, as if the forest itself was paying attention to him in a way that forests do not normally pay attention. He did not go back. Another traveler, a trader who moved goods between the settlements in the region, told Coyle something even stranger. He said he had seen covered wagons on the old roads at night, wagons moving people who did not want to be seen. The trader had been making a late run between towns, trying to reach shelter before a storm hit, when he had come around a bend and found himself face to face with a line of wagons moving in the opposite direction. The wagons were covered with heavy canvas, and the people driving them were men in long coats who did not speak or nod or acknowledge him in any way. They just passed him on the road as if he were not there. The trader had tried to see inside one of the wagons as it passed. The canvas was tied down tight, but he had caught a glimpse through a gap, and what he had seen was faces. Silent faces, watching him from inside the darkness of the wagon. Men and women and children, packed in tight, not bound, but not moving either, just staring at him with expressions he could not read. He had asked people in the next town about the wagons, but no one knew anything about them. No one had seen them. No one had heard of any group moving through the area that night. The trader never saw the wagons again, but he never forgot those faces either, looking out at him from under the canvas, and he never traveled that road after dark again. Adding the accounts to the growing pile of paper on his desk, and the pile grew faster than he expected it to, because once he started asking, people started remembering. It was as if the question itself unlocked something in them, some memory they had been carrying around for years without quite knowing what to do with it. A woman who ran the general store told him about a night in the previous winter when she had heard wagon wheels on the road outside her house. Wagon wheels that should not have been there, because the road did not lead anywhere at that hour, and no one she knew traveled at night in that kind of cold. She had gone to the window and pulled back the curtain, and she had seen a line of covered wagons moving past her house in the moonlight, silent as ghosts, the horses' hooves wrapped in cloth so they made no sound on the frozen ground. She had counted 7 wagons before the line ended, and then they were gone, and in the morning there were no tracks in the snow to prove they had ever been there. An old man who lived alone in a cabin at the edge of the timber told Coyle about lights he sometimes saw in the woods at night. Not lanterns, he said, and not the kind of glow that a campfire makes. These were steadier lights, whiter, and they moved in ways that lanterns did not move. They went up and down as if they were being carried, but they also seemed to hover sometimes, staying in one place for hours before drifting off through the trees. He had stopped going out at night because of them. He kept his door barred and his shutters closed, and when he heard sounds in the woods he did not investigate. He had lived in that cabin for 40 years, and he said the lights had started maybe 10 years ago, and they had grown more frequent every year since. A young man who worked as a hand on one of the larger farms told Coyle about a place he had found while looking for a lost cow. He had followed the animal's tracks up into the hills to the north, into country he did not usually enter, and he had come to a clearing that should not have existed. The clearing was perfectly circular, he said, as if someone had drawn it with a compass. The ground inside it was bare of trees and even of grass, just packed dirt that looked like it had been walked on by many feet over a long time. And in the center of the clearing there was a stone. Just one stone, standing upright, about the height of a man, with markings on it that were not letters he recognized. The cow was not there. He had never gone back to that clearing, and he had never told anyone else about it until Coyle asked. Coyle wrote all of this down. He filled pages with the accounts, and as he wrote, a picture began to emerge that he did not want to see but could not stop seeing. A picture of a landscape that was not what he had always believed it to be. A picture of something old and hidden and still active, still moving through the woods at night, still being systematically dismantled, while everyone he knew went about their lives as if the world they lived in was the only world there had ever been. He decided to look at the records. The county kept its records in a small room at the back of the courthouse, in wooden filing cabinets that had been there since before Coyle had taken office. The records were not organized well. The county had never been rich enough to afford a proper clerk, and the job of maintaining the files had passed from one part-time hand to another over the decades, each of them filing things in slightly different ways, each of them leaving gaps and inconsistencies that had never been fully sorted out. But Coyle knew the records well enough to find what he was looking for. He pulled the census pages for the northern part of the county, the townships that bordered the deep timber where the boy said the settlement had been. He laid the pages out on his desk in chronological order, going back as far as the records went, which was to the 1850s when the county had first been organized. And what he found made him sit down very slowly and put his head in his hands. Because the records were wrong. Not wrong in the sense of being sloppy or incomplete. Wrong in the sense of having been deliberately altered. There were pages where entire households had been listed and then scratched out with a heavy pen, the ink so thick over the names that Coyle could barely make out what had been written there originally. There were pages where the count of residents in a particular township jumped or dropped by dozens between one census and the next, with no fires or floods or epidemics recorded to explain the change. There were survey pages where boundary lines had been redrawn, where properties that had once been marked as occupied were now marked as unclaimed wilderness, where roads that had been shown on earlier maps simply did not appear on later ones. And there were the blanks. That was the worst part. There were places on the map, whole sections of the northern county, where the records simply stopped. Where earlier surveys had shown farms and houses and cleared fields, later surveys showed nothing at all. Not empty land. Just nothing. As if the surveyors who came later had decided that those sections were not worth mapping, or as if they had been told not to map them. Coyle spent 3 days going through the records. He barely slept. He barely ate. He compared page against page, cross-referencing names and dates, trying to build a picture of what the northern county had looked like 50 years ago and what it looked like now. And the picture that emerged was of a place that had been slowly, methodically, administratively erased. 40 households, at least, that had existed in the 1870s and 1880s and had simply ceased to appear in the records by the 1900s. No death certificates. No property transfers. No indication that anyone had moved out or sold their land or died of any cause. They had just stopped being counted. And once they stopped being counted, they stopped existing, at least as far as the county was concerned. Coyle thought about the boy sitting in the office, eating another meal, watching the adults with those steady, calculating eyes. He thought about the boy's description of the men in gray with their papers, of the way papers could make things allowed, of the way once the papers were correct, there was nothing anyone could do to stop what came next. He thought about the pages in front of him with the names scratched out, and he wondered who had held the pen that had scratched them out, and whether that person had known what they were doing when they did it. He went home that night and did not tell his wife what he had found. He sat at the kitchen table long after she had gone to bed, staring at the wall, trying to understand what it would mean if the boy was telling the truth. Because if the boy was telling the truth, then Coyle had been sheriff for 19 years of a county that was not what he thought it was. He had been enforcing laws in a place where the laws did not apply to everyone, where some people could arrive with papers and make other people disappear, and where the disappearances were then written out of the record as if they had never happened. He thought about how many times he must have walked past the evidence and not seen it. How many times he must have ridden through the northern part of the county and looked at the empty land and thought it had always been empty. How many times he had believed the version of reality that had been handed to him without ever questioning where that version had come from or who had constructed it. The next morning, he went back to the office. The boy was still there, sleeping on a cot they had set up in the corner. Coyle looked at him for a long time before he woke him. He asked the boy to tell him more about the men in gray. He asked him to describe what they looked like, how they spoke, what kind of horses they rode, everything he could remember. The boy sat up on the cot and rubbed his eyes and began to describe them. He said there were usually 3 or 4 of them together, though sometimes there were more when a larger operation was underway. They rode horses that were bigger than the horses the local people had, taller and heavier, the kind of horses that would have cost more than most families in the valley earned in a year. Their coats were long and gray, made of a heavy wool that did not look like anything the boy had seen woven in his settlement. The coats had many pockets, some of them large enough to hold rolls of paper, others small enough to hold pens or seals or the other tools of their trade. They did not carry weapons that the boy could see. not rifles or pistols or knives on their belts. But he said the crews that came with them were armed, and the crews always did what the men in gray told them to do without question, so the men in gray did not need to carry weapons themselves. They spoke English, but with an accent the boy could not place. Not the drawl of the hill people, not the clipped speech of the townsmen he had heard since coming out of the woods. Something else, something flatter, something that sounded like it had been learned rather than grown into. As if English was not their first language, but they had studied it until they could use it well enough to conduct their business. They were polite. That was the thing the boy kept coming back to. They were always polite. They did not shout. They did not threaten. They did not use force unless they had to, and even then they used it calmly, as if they were performing a task that had to be done and there was no reason to be emotional about it. When they came to take someone, they would knock on the door of the house or the shelter or wherever the person was living. They would present their papers. They would explain what was happening. They would wait for the person to gather their belongings, and then they would escort them to the wagon. The boy said the old woman who had raised him told him once that the politeness was the worst part. She said it would have been easier if they had been cruel, if they had come with anger and violence, because then at least the people they took would have understood what was happening to them. But the politeness made it feel like something ordinary, something administrative, something that had to happen because it was written down that it had to happen. And when a thing feels ordinary, people do not fight it. They just let it happen, because fighting an ordinary thing seems absurd, and they only realize too late that ordinary things can be as deadly as any war. Cole wrote this down too. He was filling notebook after notebook now, using paper that he was paying for out of his own pocket because the county supply had run out, and he did not want to explain to anyone what he was writing about. He asked the boy where the wagons went. Where were the people taken when the men in gray loaded them up and drove them away? The boy said he did not know for sure, but he knew they went north because he had seen them leave, and the road they took ran north into the deeper woods. Beyond that, no one who had gone with them had ever come back to say. There were rumors among the others, whispered stories that got passed around when the men in gray were not close enough to hear. Some said the wagons went to a place where the people were put to work, though no one could say what kind of work or for whose benefit. Some said the wagons went to a place where the people were simply held, kept alive but kept separate, so they could not tell anyone what they remembered. And some said the wagons went to a place where the people were killed, cleanly and quietly, and buried in ground that had never been mapped by any county surveyor. The boy did not know which of the stories was true. He said the old woman had believed the second one, that the people were held somewhere and kept alive, because she said the men in gray did not seem like the kind who would waste useful workers. But the old woman had also said that it did not matter which story was true. What mattered was that no one came back. Whatever happened at the end of that road, it was final. Once you got into one of those wagons, you were gone. Coyle asked him if anyone had ever tried to escape, if anyone had ever refused to get into the wagons, or tried to run, or fought back against the men in gray. The boy said yes. He said a man from a neighboring settlement had refused, once, years before the boy was born, but still remembered by the old people. The man had been strong, a stonecutter by trade, and when the men in gray had come to his door with their papers he had refused to sign, and he had refused to gather his belongings, and he had told them to leave his family alone or he would kill them all. The men in gray had not argued. They had simply left. They had said they would come back with the proper authorization, and they had ridden away. The next morning, the man had woken up to find his entire family dead in their beds. His wife, his 3 children, his mother-in-law who lived with them, all of them dead, with no marks on their bodies, no signs of violence, nothing to indicate what had killed them except that they were cold and would not wake. The man had gone mad. He had wandered into the forest with an axe, swinging it at nothing, screaming words that no one could understand. Some of the others had tried to follow him, to bring him back, but they had lost him in the deep timber, and no one had ever seen him again. A few days later, the men in gray had returned, and this time they had brought a crew with them, and they had taken down the stonecutter's house and everything in it, including the bodies of his family. And when they were done, there was nothing left to show that the family had ever existed. No graves, no possessions, no record that they had lived in that spot for 3 generations. The old woman who told the boy this story had wept as she told it. She had said the stonecutter had been her cousin. She had said his wife had been her best friend. She had said the children had been like her own grandchildren. And she had said that after the men in gray had done what they did, no one in the settlement had ever spoken of that family again, because to speak of them was to invite the men in gray back, and no one wanted that. Coyle listened to all of this and did not write anything for a long time. He just sat there, holding his pen, staring at the boy, trying to understand what kind of world he was hearing about. Because it was not the world he thought he lived in. In his world, people did not just disappear. Families did not just die overnight without cause. Buildings did not just get torn down by anonymous crews in the dark. His world was governed by laws he understood, by neighbors he knew, by a system of accountability that might have been imperfect but was at least visible. If a crime was committed, there was an investigation. If a person went missing, there was a search. If property changed hands, there was paperwork that anyone could look at. But the world the boy was describing had none of those things. Or rather, it had a shadow version of them. A mimicry of paperwork and process that looked correct on the surface but served the opposite of the purpose that paperwork was supposed to serve. In that world, the paperwork did not create accountability. It created invisibility. It did not preserve the record. It replaced the record with a false one and then destroyed the original. Coyle asked the boy how many of the others were left. How many people were still living in the ruins when he ran? The boy thought about it for a long time. He counted on his fingers, trying to remember faces and names. Finally, he said maybe 30, maybe 35. Not many. Not compared to what the settlement had been in the old days, when the old people were young and the tall buildings still stood and the lights still came on at dusk without anyone touching them. The old woman had told him stories about how the settlement had been in its full glory. She said there had been hundreds of people, maybe thousands, though the boy was not sure the old woman could really know that. She said there had been schools where children learned things that the boy could not even imagine, whole libraries full of books written in the old script that no one alive now could read. She said there had been music that came out of the walls, not from any instrument that a person had to play, but from the walls themselves, a kind of song that filled the air and made even the hardest work feel light. The boy said the old woman had cried when she told him those stories. She had said the world had been so much bigger then, so much richer, so much more alive. And now, she had said, the world was smaller every year. The men in gray came and made it smaller. They took away buildings and people and memories, and each time they took something, the world shrank a little more, until soon there would be nothing left but the version of the world that they wanted people to see. Coyle asked the boy what the old woman thought the men in gray wanted. What was the purpose of all this dismantling and disappearing? Why go to such lengths to erase a settlement that no one else even knew existed? The boy said the old woman had a theory, though she admitted it was only a theory. She thought the men in gray were not the ones who wanted the erasure. She thought they worked for someone else, someone she called simply the ones who write. She said the ones who write were the people who decided what history would be, who decided what the world would remember and what it would forget. She said they lived far away, in places she could not imagine, and they had the power to make things true or false just by writing them down or leaving them out. The men in gray were the hands of the ones who write. They went out into the world and did the physical work of making the record match what the ones who write wanted the record to say. If the ones who write decided that a settlement should not exist, the men in gray went and made sure that the settlement did not exist. They tore down the buildings. They took the people. They edited the records. They made the world match the version of the world that the ones who write had decided upon. The old woman said the ones who write had been doing this for a very long time. She said the world was full of erased places, of forgotten peoples, of civilizations that had once been great and that no one now remembered. She said the history that people were taught in schools and in churches was not the real history. It was the history that the ones who write had chosen to allow. The real history was buried, scattered, hidden in the ruins of places like their settlement, waiting for someone to dig it up. But no one ever dug it up, the old woman had said, because the men in gray were always watching. And anyone who dug too deeply, who asked too many questions, who found too much evidence of what had been erased, was themselves erased. Quietly, politely, with the proper paperwork. Coyle put down his pen and rubbed his face with his hands. He was tired in a way he had never been tired before. Not the physical tiredness of long days in the saddle or long nights holding vigil over a dying man. This was a different tiredness, a tiredness of the mind. a tiredness that came from having to hold too many things in his head at once and not knowing what to do with any of them. He looked at the boy. The boy looked back at him with those steady eyes, the eyes of a child who had already seen more than most adults would see in a lifetime, and who had somehow survived it without breaking. Coyle asked him what he wanted, what he needed, whether there was anything Coyle could do for him. The boy thought about it for a moment, and then he said something that Coyle wrote down and underlined twice in his notebook. He said he wanted Coyle to remember. Just that. Just to remember what he had said. Not to try to save the others, because the others were already gone or would be soon, and there was nothing anyone could do about them. Not to try to fight the men in gray, because the men in gray always won. Just to remember. To keep the memory alive somewhere, in some form, so that at least one small piece of what had been would not be lost with the rest. Coyle promised he would remember. He said it out loud, in the presence of the other men who were in the room, so that they would remember too. He said he would write it all down. He said he would find a way to preserve it. The boy nodded, and he ate the last piece of bread on his plate, and he asked if he could sleep for a while, because he was very tired. Coyle let him sleep. He sat by the cot, and watched the boy's chest rise and fall, and thought about everything he had heard. He thought about the surveyor's notebook with the word deliberate written in the margin. He thought about the woman at the general store watching the silent wagons pass her window in the moonlight. He thought about the old man who kept his shutters closed against the lights in the woods. He thought about the young farmhand who had found a clearing that should not have existed, with a standing stone in the middle of it carved with marks he could not read. He thought about the pages in the county records with the names scratched out. And he thought about the boy sleeping in front of him, the last witness to a place that had officially never existed, whose entire memory of his home and his family and everyone he had ever known was now stored in one small child's mind and in the pages of Coyle's notebooks. He knew, sitting there, that the boy was in danger. He knew that if the boy's story was true, then the men in gray would come for the boy eventually. They had let the settlement die in silence because the settlement was in a place no one visited. But now the boy was in town. He was talking to people. He was telling the story that the old woman had told him never to tell. And the men in gray, according to everything the boy had said, followed talk. Coyle began to make plans. He decided he would move the boy out of the sheriff's office and into a private home, someplace where the boy would be less visible. He would ask Harlan to take him, since Harlan had been the one to find him, and Harlan lived out on the edge of the settled area where fewer people passed by. He would ask everyone who had heard the boy's story to keep silent about what they had heard. He would put the notebooks in a safe place, somewhere they would not be found if anyone came looking. He worked on the plans for hours that night, refining them, thinking through every detail. He was going to save the boy. He was going to hide him. He was going to protect the story that the boy had told him. But when he woke up the next morning and went to the office to put his plans into action, he found that his plans no longer mattered. Because two men were already there, waiting for him, sitting on the bench outside his office as if they had been sitting there for hours, patient, unhurried, the picture of calm. They wore long gray coats. Coyle stopped in the street when he saw them. His breath caught in his throat. He felt the same cold feeling that Harlan had described feeling when he first saw the boy in the field, that ancient, wordless recognition that something was wrong. The men stood up when they saw him. They were tall, both of them, taller than Coyle by a head, and they moved with a quiet economy that suggested they were not the kind of men who wasted motion. Their faces were unremarkable. Coyle tried later to remember what they looked like, and he could not. He could remember that they had faces. He could remember that the faces were not ugly and not handsome, not old and not young, not from any place he could place. But he could not remember the specific features. It was as if the faces had been designed to be forgotten, as if the memory slid off of them and could not find purchase. They introduced themselves with names that Coyle also could not later remember, though he wrote them down at the time. When he looked at his notes later, the names were still there in his handwriting, but they meant nothing to him. They were just sounds, just syllables, with no person attached to them. They said they were representatives of an office that Coyle had never heard of. They said they had been informed that a displaced minor had been taken into the county's care, and that they had come to collect the minor for placement in an appropriate institution. They said they had the necessary documentation. They produced the documentation. Coyle looked at it. He was not a lawyer. He had never been trained to evaluate legal papers of the kind the men were showing him. But the papers looked correct. They had seals on them, and signatures, and dates, and all of the language he would have expected such papers to have. They authorized the two men to take custody of any displaced minor found within the county, without further judicial process, and to transport that minor to a facility that was named on the documents, but that Coyle had never heard of and could not have found on any map. He held the papers in his hands and felt the weight of them. It was the same weight that the boy had described, the weight that made things allowed. Once these papers were in his hands, he had two choices. He could accept them, or he could refuse them. And if he refused them, he did not know what would happen. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps the men in gray would simply leave and come back later with different papers, and eventually with a crew. And then Coyle himself might not be the sheriff anymore, or might not be alive anymore, and his family might not exist anymore, and there would be nothing anyone could point to as evidence of what had gone wrong. He thought about the stonecutter and his family in the boy's story. He thought about how the men in gray had left when the stonecutter had refused, and how they had come back the next morning to find the whole family cold in their beds. Coyle handed the papers back. He asked the men to wait while he went to get the boy. He went into the office. The boy was awake, sitting on the cot, watching the door. Coyle wondered later how much the boy had understood of what was happening from the sound of voices outside. He wondered whether the boy had known, from the moment he heard the men in gray speaking, that they had come for him. He wondered whether the boy had considered running. But the boy did not run. He sat on the cot and waited. And when Coyle came in and looked at him, the boy nodded, as if to say that he understood. Coyle wanted to say something. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to promise that he would come and find the boy, that he would rescue him, that he would not let this happen. But he could not make any of those promises, because he did not believe any of them himself. The men in gray were already there. The papers were already correct. Whatever was going to happen to the boy was already in motion, and Coyle was not powerful enough to stop it. He asked the boy if there was anything he wanted to say before they went out. The boy thought for a long moment. Then he said, "Remember." That was all. Just the same word he had used before. Remember. Coyle nodded. He took the boy's hand, and together they walked out of the office into the morning light where the two men in gray were waiting. The men were polite. That was the thing Coyle wrote about most in his final notes. They were unfailingly polite. They thanked him for his service. They complimented him on the care he had taken of the child. They assured him that the child would be well looked after, that he would be placed in an environment appropriate to his needs, that there was no cause for concern. They lifted the boy onto a wagon that was waiting in the street. Coyle had not noticed the wagon when he first arrived. He was not sure when it had appeared. It was a plain-covered wagon, canvas over a wooden frame, drawn by two heavy horses that stood so still they might have been carved from stone. There was no driver in the seat. The two men in gray climbed up together, one taking the reins, and they nodded to Coyle one final time. The boy looked at Coyle from the back of the wagon. His face was calm. He did not cry. He did not call out. He simply looked, with those steady eyes, until the wagon pulled away and the canvas closed around him, and he was gone. Coyle stood in the street long after the wagon had disappeared around the bend. He did not remember how long he stood there. When he finally moved, it was because a chill wind had come up and his hands had gone numb. He went back into his office and sat at his desk and stared at the notebooks he had filled with the boy's story. He picked up his pen. He tried to write down what had just happened, but his hand would not move. He sat there for what felt like hours, holding the pen over the paper, unable to make himself put down a single word. Finally, he wrote one sentence. Just one. He wrote, "They wore gray and I did not stop them, and I have not slept right since." Then he closed the notebook and put it in a drawer and locked the drawer and put the key in his pocket, and he did not open that drawer again for the rest of the time he held the office of sheriff, which was less than a year. The story of what happened next in the county is harder to tell because the records go quiet again. Coyle stopped asking questions. The people who had spoken to him stopped mentioning what they had said. The wagons still passed on the roads at night, but no one talked about them. The lights still moved through the woods, but no one looked. The county returned to its normal rhythms of planting and harvesting and burying and being born, and for anyone who had not been there in the office that autumn, it was as if the boy had never existed at all. But Coyle knew, and Harlan knew, and the handful of other men who had been in the office that week knew, and each of them, in their own way, carried the knowledge like a weight, like a stone that had been placed in their chests and could not be removed. Harlan sold his farm within 2 years. He moved his family west, to a state where he had no relatives and no connections, and he started over from nothing. He never told anyone why he had left. When his own children asked, he said the land in the Ozarks had gone bad, that the soil had turned against him, that there was no future for a farmer in that valley anymore. But his wife knew that was not the real reason. She had seen the way he looked at the northern woods every evening after the boy had been taken. She had seen the way he could not stand to be outside after dark. She had seen the way he flinched whenever a wagon passed on the road. Coyle resigned the office of sheriff the following spring. He had held the position for 19 years, and he had planned to hold it until he died. He had never wanted to do anything else. But he could not do it anymore. He could not enforce laws in a place where the laws did not apply to everyone. He could not pretend that the world was what he had once believed it to be. He moved his family east, back to the town where he had been born, and he took a job as a clerk in a store, and he lived out the rest of his life in what his neighbors described as a state of quiet melancholy that no one ever fully understood. He never spoke of the boy in public again, but he kept the notebooks. He kept them locked in that drawer, and the drawer traveled with him when he moved, and he kept the key on a chain around his neck until the day he died. His wife, going through his things after his death, found the key but did not know what it went to. It was not until years later, when a great-nephew of Coyle's was going through some old family belongings in an attic, that the drawer was found and the key was matched to it, and the notebooks came out into the light for the first time in decades. The great-nephew read them. He did not know what to make of them. He was a practical man, not given to belief in strange things, and he thought at first that his great-uncle had gone slightly mad in his final years and had written down a fantasy. But there were too many details. There were too many cross-references to real people and real places. There were the accounts of the surveyor and the preacher and the trader and the woman at the general store and the old man with the shutters and the young farmhand. And when the great-nephew tried to look up those people in the records of the time, some of them turned out to be real. Not all of them. Some of them had left no trace. But enough of them were real that the great-nephew could not simply dismiss the notebooks as fantasy. He put them away again. He did not know what else to do with them. He did not want to publish them, because he did not want to be the person who put such a story into the world. But he did not destroy them, either, because he could not shake the feeling that they were important, that they were the record of something that had happened, and that destroying them would be a kind of complicity in whatever had been done. The notebooks stayed in a box in his attic for another 40 years. When he died, they passed to his own children, and then to their children, and eventually they came into the possession of a distant cousin who was more curious than her ancestors had been. She read them. She researched them. She began, slowly, to piece together the story that Coyle had tried to preserve. And when she did, she started to notice things. She found it in the accounts of settlers in Ohio who had reported finding earthworks in the shape of perfect geometric figures, earthworks that could not have been built by the indigenous peoples the history books credited them to, and that were far too old to have been built by the settlers themselves. She found it in the letters of surveyors in Wisconsin who had mapped stone structures in the deep woods and then found, years later, that their maps had been altered by someone in the state offices and that the structures they had documented no longer appeared on any official record. She found it in the memoirs of frontier preachers in Kentucky who had written about encounters with people who did not seem to fit any of the ethnic or cultural categories the preachers were familiar with. People who lived in isolated communities in the mountains and who spoke languages the preachers could not identify and who, within a few years of being written about, were simply gone, their communities empty, their houses falling into ruin. She found it in the newspaper archives of the late 19th century, where small local stories occasionally appeared about strange discoveries in various parts of the country, discoveries that never seemed to get followed up on, that never made it into the national papers, that were reported once and then forgotten. A farmer plowing his field and turning up cut stones that formed the corner of a foundation of a building much larger than any that had ever stood on his land. A boy fishing in a river and pulling up a coin with markings on it that no numismatist could identify. A hunter following a wounded deer into a cave and finding a chamber inside with walls that had been smoothed by human hands, and paintings on those walls, and objects on the floor that looked like tools, but that did not correspond to any tools he knew how to use. None of these stories were followed up. None of them made it into the history books. They existed in the archives, buried in old newspapers that no one read anymore, waiting for someone to notice them and put them together. The distant cousin put them together. She spent years doing it. She traveled to the places where the accounts had originated. She visited the sites when she could find them. She talked to the descendants of the people who had reported the strange things when any of them were willing to talk. And what she began to see, slowly, with the patience of someone who had come to believe that patience was the only tool that would work against what she was investigating, was that the pattern Coyle had described in his notebooks was not just a local phenomenon. It was continental. It was, perhaps, global. Someone, somewhere, had spent a very long time and a great deal of effort erasing whole categories of things from the historical record, and the erasure was so thorough and so consistent that it could only be the product of deliberate, organized action over many generations. Who was behind it? She did not know. The old woman in the boy's story had called them the ones who write, and that was as good a name as any. They were the people who decided what the record would say. They were the people who determined what would be remembered and what would be forgotten. And they had decided, for reasons that she could only guess at, that certain places and certain peoples should not be part of the record that ordinary people were allowed to see. She thought about what it would mean if this was true. She thought about what kind of world she was actually living in. She thought about all the things she had been taught in school about history, about the founding of the country, about the peoples who had lived on the land before the settlers arrived. And she wondered how much of what she had been taught was accurate and how much of it was a story that had been constructed to hide other stories. She thought about the boy in the sheriff's office in 1915, sitting on his cot, saying the word remember. She kept the notebooks. She made copies of them, and she put the copies in different places so that if something happened to the originals, the copies would still exist. She began to write her own account, adding to what Coyle had written, adding everything she had found in her own research, trying to build the picture that Coyle had started but had not been able to finish. She was working on it when she died. Her manuscript was not complete, but what she had written was preserved by her own descendants, and it eventually made its way into the hands of researchers who took it seriously, who began to look at the pattern with the tools of modern investigation, who began to find their own evidence to add to hers. And piece by piece, the story that the boy had told Coyle in 1915 began to reassemble itself, 100 years after it had first been told and then hidden away. The story is not finished being reassembled. It may never be finished. There is too much that has been hidden, too much that has been destroyed, too much that has been overwritten with plausible-sounding lies. But every year, a little more of it comes back into the light. Every year, someone finds another piece of stone in a forest where the history books say no stone should be. Every year, someone finds another census page with names scratched out, or another surveyor's notebook with the word deliberate written in the margin, or another old letter describing wagons on a road in the middle of the night carrying people who did not want to be seen. The pattern is there for anyone who wants to look at it. It has always been there. The men in gray, whoever they were, whoever they still are, have not been able to hide it completely. They have hidden enough of it that most people never notice. But not all of it. Never all of it. Because the truth, as the old woman told the boy, always leaves something behind. A stone. A memory. A word scratched on a page that someone forgot to erase. And as long as those pieces exist, the possibility exists that someone, someday, will put them together again. We'll look at the shape of what has been left behind and see the outline of what was once there. We'll understand that the world they have been handed is not the whole world, and that the history they have been taught is not the whole history, and that there is something larger and older and stranger underneath all of it, waiting to be found. The boy is gone. Wherever the men in gray took him, whatever they did with him, he did not come back. His name was never recorded, because he would not give it. His face was never photographed. He exists now only in the words that Coyle wrote down in those notebooks. Words that describe a child who walked out of a forest in Missouri in the autumn of 1915 and told a story that no one wanted to write down. But Coyle wrote it down anyway. Some of it. Enough of it. And because he wrote it down, the boy is still here, in a way. He is still in that office, sitting on his cot, saying the word remember. He is still asking the sheriff to keep the memory alive. He is still asking the reader, whoever the reader turns out to be, to look at the world with different eyes and to ask the questions that the ones who write do not want asked. Who took it down? Where did they take everyone? What else has been erased? What else has been hidden? What else is still out there, in the deep woods, in the empty pages, in the small towns where nothing important is supposed to have happened, waiting for someone to notice it? The stone is still out there. That is the one thing you can be sure of. The stone that the men in gray could not carry away. The stone that they've buried under dirt and new trees. The stone that they hoped no one would ever look for. It is still out there. It is under the leaves in a forest somewhere. It is under the foundation of a building that was put up over it. It is under a field that has been plowed for 100 years without anyone noticing what was buried below the plow line. The stone remembers what has been forgotten. And if you go looking for it, if you learn to see the shape of what has been erased and the patterns of what has been allowed to remain, you will find it. Not all at once, not easily, but you will find it, piece by piece, the way the distant cousin found it, the way Coyle began to find it, the way the boy already knew it because he had grown up walking on it. And when you find it, you will understand what Coyle understood in his final years, sitting at his kitchen table, staring at the wall. You will understand what the boy meant when he said remember. You will understand that the world is not what you were told it was, and that the history is not what you were taught, and that somewhere out there, in the shadows behind the story that has been allowed to stay, there are other stories, older stories, stories that were told once by people who lived and loved and built things, and were then quietly, politely, administratively removed from the record. They are still there. They are waiting. And the question the boy left behind is the same question he asked when he was 10 years old, standing in Coyle's office, describing the tall stone buildings and the lights that came on at dusk without anyone touching them. The question is simple. Who took it down? And where did they take everyone? And that question did not die with the boy. It did not rot in that drawer alongside Coyle's notebooks. It lived on in the silence that followed, in the things people noticed but refused to talk about, in the cracks between what was recorded and what was real. Because the boy in the Ozarks was not an isolated case. He was not a single strange event in a single strange county. He was one thread in a pattern so vast that seeing it requires you to step back far enough that the ordinary explanations stop working and the uncomfortable ones begin. To understand that pattern, you have to look at something that happened across the entire country during the same period the boy was alive. Something that has been taught in schools and museums as an act of charity, as a great humanitarian effort, as one of the kindest things America ever did for its children. It carries a name that sounds noble and compassionate, a name that makes people nod and feel good about the past. The orphan trains. Between the 1850s and the 1920s, somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 children were gathered up from various locations, mostly said to be the slums and overcrowded tenements of eastern cities like New York and Boston and Philadelphia, and they were loaded onto railroad cars and shipped west and south across the country to be distributed to strangers. That is the word that was used in the records of the time. Distributed. As if the children were goods, commodities, products to be moved from a place of surplus to a place of demand. The official story is straightforward enough. The cities were overcrowded. Waves of immigration had filled the tenements with families who could not afford to feed their children. Reformers, led by a minister named Charles Loring Brace and his Children's Aid Society, conceived of a plan to save these children by sending them to the wholesome countryside, where good Christian families would take them in and raise them as their own. The children would escape poverty and disease. The families would gain an extra pair of hands for the farm. Everyone would benefit. That is the story you will find in textbooks. That is the story that gets told in documentaries and museum exhibits, and the occasional feel-good newspaper article about a reunion between orphan train riders who found each other decades later. And parts of it are true. There were overcrowded cities. There were impoverished children. There were reformers who genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. But the story has holes in it. And the holes are not small. Start with the numbers. 250,000 children, at minimum. Some estimates put the number closer to 400,000. That is not a small charitable program. That is a mass movement of human beings on a scale that rivals some of the largest forced migrations in history. And it happened over the course of roughly 70 years, which means that on average, thousands of children were being moved every single year, year after year, decade after decade, for the better part of a century. Now think about the record keeping. In an era that documented land transactions down to the inch, that recorded cattle brands and property lines, and the serial numbers of railroad cars, The origins of hundreds of thousands of human children were left astonishingly vague. Many of the children who rode the orphan trains had no birth certificates. Many had no records of any kind linking them to the families or institutions they were said to have come from. Many could not say where they had been born, or who their parents were, or how they had ended up in the care of the organizations that put them on the trains. The organizations that ran the orphan trains kept records, but those records were often incomplete, sometimes contradictory, and in many cases have been lost or destroyed in the years since. When descendants of orphan train riders have tried to trace their ancestors back to their origins, they frequently hit dead ends. The trail goes cold. The records stop. The child appears in the system as if from nowhere, with no past, no family, no point of origin that can be verified. Now, in an age that was obsessed with documentation, that kept meticulous records of immigration and naturalization and property ownership and births and deaths and marriages, how do you lose track of where 250,000 children came from? The answer you are given is that the children were from the streets, that they were foundlings and runaways and abandoned waifs whose parents were unknown or dead or simply gone. And some of them were, but all of them. Every single one of the hundreds of thousands of children who rode those trains came from a background so chaotic that not a single piece of documentation survived to tell where they had been before they boarded. That is not poor bookkeeping. That is a void. And voids that large do not happen by accident. They happen because someone decided that the information should not exist. Read the accounts that the orphan train riders themselves left behind, the ones who survived into old age and were willing to talk about their experiences, and something else emerges. Something that does not fit the official story at all. Many of the riders remembered being taken, not rescued. Taken. They remembered being removed from homes that were not slums, from communities that were not cities, from places that did not match the descriptions they were later given of where they had supposedly come from. Some of them remembered open country, fields and forests and stone buildings, not tenement hallways and factory smoke. Some of them remembered being told they were going on a trip and would come back, and then never coming back. Some of them remembered being separated from siblings and parents who were present and alive and begging for the children not to be taken, and the children being taken anyway. One woman, interviewed in the 1980s when she was in her 90s, said she remembered a house with walls that were cool to the touch even in summer, walls made of a stone she had never seen again in her long life. She remembered a garden behind the house, where vegetables grew larger than any she had seen since. She remembered her mother crying and holding her, and then men coming to the door and her mother letting go. She said she had been told, later, that she was from New York City, that her mother had been a seamstress who could not afford to keep her, that she had been rescued from a life of poverty and given a chance at something better. But she had never lived in New York City. She knew that with a certainty that age had not dimmed. She had never seen a city until the train carried her through one. The place she remembered was not a city. It was somewhere else, somewhere with stone and gardens and cool walls, and she had never been able to find it again because she had been 3 years old when they took her, and she did not know the name of the place or even what direction it was in. She had spent her whole life wondering. Another writer, a man who had been placed with a farming family in Nebraska, told researchers that he remembered speaking a language before he learned English. Not a foreign language that anyone could identify. Not German or Italian or any of the immigrant languages that would have made sense given the official story. A language that no one he had ever met in his entire life recognized. He had lost it by the time he was 6 or 7. It had faded out of him the way childhood memories fade, until all he had left were a few words that he could not translate, and that sounded, he said, like nothing he had ever heard spoken anywhere. He had tried, in his later years, to find someone who could identify the language. He had gone to universities. He had spoken the words he remembered to linguists and anthropologists and anyone else who might know what they were. No one did. The words did not correspond to any known language, living or dead. He died without knowing what language he had spoken as a child or who had taught it to him. Another writer, a woman who had been placed with a family in Kansas, remembered something different. She remembered a place underground. Not a basement or a cellar, but a real place, a large space beneath the surface of the earth where people lived and worked and children played. She remembered the light in that place, a light that was not from candles or lanterns or any flame, a steady, even light that came from the ceiling and the walls, and that never flickered, never went out, never needed to be tended. She remembered being brought up out of that place and put on a wagon and then put on a train and then given to a woman in Kansas who smelled like lye soap and told her that her name was now Mary and that she should forget whatever name she had been called before. She had not forgotten, but she would not tell anyone what the name had been. She said it did not belong in this world, that it belonged to the other place, the underground place, and that saying it out loud in this world would be like bringing something across a border that was not supposed to be crossed. These are not isolated accounts. They are scattered across the records of the orphan train era, buried in oral histories and interview transcripts and the letters that elderly writers wrote to each other and to researchers in the final decades of their lives. They are not the majority of accounts. Most orphan train riders told stories that fit the official narrative well enough, stories of poverty and displacement and eventual placement with families who were sometimes kind and sometimes cruel. But even among those more conventional accounts, there are details that snag, moments that do not quite fit, memories that feel like they belong to a different story than the one being told. A boy who remembered being bathed in water that glowed. A girl who remembered a song that made her sleep and that she could never reproduce in waking life. A pair of brothers who both remembered the same woman, not their mother, telling them that they would forget, that the forgetting was part of it, that by the time they were grown they would not remember any of this, and that was how it was supposed to work. The forgetting was part of it. Think about that sentence. Think about what it implies. Not that children naturally forget their early years, which they do, but that someone knew they would forget and was counting on it, was using the natural process of childhood amnesia as a tool, as a mechanism for erasing memories that were not supposed to survive into adulthood. If you wanted to erase a people, if you wanted to remove an entire population from the world and make sure no one ever knew they had existed, how would you do it? You could kill them, but bodies leave evidence. You could imprison them, but prisons can be found. You could drive them into exile, but exiles form communities and keep their memories alive, and eventually someone asks where they came from. But if you took their children, if you separated the children from the adults before the children were old enough to form permanent memories, and if you scattered those children across an entire continent, giving each one a new name and a new family and a new story about where they had come from, then within a single generation, the memory would be gone. The adults would die or be dealt with in whatever way the men in gray dealt with them. The children would grow up believing they were orphans from the cities. They would have no memory of stone streets or cool walls or lights that did not need fuel. They would have no memory of the others. They would become ordinary citizens of the ordinary world, and the extraordinary world they had been born into would exist only in the faintest traces, in half-remembered words of an unidentifiable language, in a feeling of wrongness that they could never quite explain, in dreams of underground places lit by sourceless light that they dismissed as the fantasies of childhood. The boy in Coyle's office described the wagons going north. He described people being loaded into covered wagons at night and driven away, never to be seen again. He described the children being taken separately, the old woman telling him to run because if the men in gray got him, they would take him too. The orphan trains went in every direction, east to west, north to south, crisscrossing the country in a web of routes that touched nearly every state. Different method, same result. Children separated from their origins, stripped of their names and their histories, placed with strangers who knew nothing about where the children had actually come from, and left to grow up in a world that had been carefully constructed to contain no evidence of the world they had left behind. The boy in the Ozarks ran south. He escaped. He came out of the trees and told his story to one man who wrote it down. But for every child who ran, how many were caught? How many were loaded onto wagons or trains and delivered to the new world that had been prepared for them? The world of farms and small towns and ordinary American life. The world where the past did not exist because the past had been administratively removed. And this is where the story widens. Because the orphan trains were not happening in isolation. They were happening at the same time as something else, something that was visible to everyone, but that almost no one thought to connect to the trains or to the disappearing settlements or to any of the other threads we have been following. All across America, in the second half of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th, cities were being built. Or rather, cities were appearing. And the way they appeared did not always make sense. Look at the photographs from that era. Look at the cities of the Midwest and the South and the West in the 1870s and 1880s. Look at the buildings. Not the wooden storefronts and the clapboard houses, but the other buildings, the ones that stand behind them in the photographs like mountains behind foothills. Massive stone structures, ornate facades, columns and arches and domes and towers. Buildings that would not look out of place in Rome or Paris or any of the great capitals of the old world. And then ask yourself who built them. Because the official story is that settlers built them. Pioneers, immigrants, people who had arrived in these places a few years or a few decades earlier with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a willingness to work hard. People who were still living in log cabins and sod houses and tents while, somehow, a few blocks away, enormous stone edifices were rising from the prairie. The logistics alone should give you pause. These buildings are made of stone, thousands of tons of it, cut and dressed and fitted together with a precision that modern builders would find challenging. Where did the stone come from? How was it transported to sites that were, in many cases, hundreds of miles from the nearest quarry? How was it lifted and placed by communities that did not have cranes or steam engines, or, in some cases, even paved roads? The official answer is that it was done by sheer human effort, by armies of laborers working with hand tools and animal power, hauling stone on wagons and lifting it with ropes and pulleys. And that answer is possible, in the same way that it is possible for a person to walk from New York to Los Angeles. Possible does not mean likely. Possible does not mean that it happened that way. Possible means that no one has a better explanation. So this one is offered and accepted and written into the textbooks, and the question is considered closed. But look closer at the photographs. Look at the ground floor windows of those massive stone buildings. In city after city, across the entire country, the ground floor windows are partially below the level of the street. Not by a few inches, by feet, sometimes by an entire story. The buildings appear to have sunk into the earth, or the earth appears to have risen around them, burying their lower levels in dirt and debris. The official explanation for this is that the cities raised their street levels. They did this, the story goes, to improve drainage, to install sewers, to deal with the mud and flooding that plagued early settlements. They brought and filled dirt and raised the streets by several feet, and the lower floors of the buildings were simply buried in the process. And again, this did happen in some places. Seattle famously raised its street level, and you can still tour the old ground floors beneath the current sidewalks. But Seattle is one city. The buried window phenomenon appears in hundreds of cities across the country. Did every one of them independently decide to raise their streets by the same amount at roughly the same time? Did every one of them bury the ground floors of their most impressive buildings and then forget that those floors had ever existed? Or is something else going on? Is it possible that the buildings were already there, that they were already partially buried when the settlers arrived, that the settlers did not build them but found them, dug them out as much as they could, moved into the upper floors, and then told the story of having built them because the alternative was to admit that someone else had been there first, someone who built on a scale and with a skill that the settlers could not match? The boy in Coyle's office, barefoot and hungry, decades before anyone would think to ask these questions publicly, described the mechanism. He described a city being pulled down and its materials being carried away. He described the ground being made to cover what could not be removed. He described the deliberate burial of a place so that future generations would think the forest had always been there. What if the same process that the boy described in the Ozarks happened in reverse in the cities? What if the buildings that settlers claimed to have built were actually buildings they had uncovered, buildings that had been standing for far longer than anyone wanted to admit? What if the street level raising was not an improvement, but a partial reburial, an effort to hide the full scale of structures that were too large to explain within the accepted timeline of American history? And what if the men in gray, the ones who came with papers and made things allowed, were not just operating in the backwoods of Missouri? What if they were operating everywhere, in every city and every county, managing the story, deciding what could be seen and what had to be hidden, what would be credited to the settlers, and what would be buried under filled dirt and forgotten? The star forts suggest exactly that. All across America and across the world, there are fortifications in the shape of perfect geometric stars. They are enormous, some of them covering hundreds of acres. Their walls are precise, their angles exact, their proportions mathematically perfect. The history books call them military engineering, products of European fortress design traditions brought to the New World by colonial powers. But the mathematics do not add up. The star forts of North America are, in many cases, far larger and far more complex than anything the colonial powers built in Europe. They appear in locations where no colonial army had the manpower or the resources to build them. They appear in states and territories that were barely settled when the forts were supposedly constructed. And the local peoples, both indigenous and settler, who lived near these forts did not build them. They moved into them. They occupied structures that were already there, the same way settlers moved into stone buildings they had not built, the same way cities grew up around foundations they had not laid. The boy said the men in gray did not always destroy. Sometimes they renamed. Sometimes they simply changed the story, assigned new origins to old structures. Let the new narrative grow over the old one like moss over stone. The Star Fort that had been built by an unknown civilization became a colonial military installation. The enormous stone building that had been standing for centuries became a courthouse that settlers had erected in 18 months. The raised stone road that ran through the forest for 4 miles became a natural ridge that happened to look like a road. Rename, reassign, and let time do the rest. Within a generation or two, everyone believes the new story because no one alive remembers the old one. And if someone does remember, if some barefoot child walks out of the woods and says the quiet thing out loud, the men in gray arrive with their papers, and the memory is folded back into the silence. Think about the scale of what the boy described. Not just a settlement in the woods. Not just a few buildings and a few dozen people. He described a civilization. He described straight stone streets and buildings taller than anything for hundreds of miles and lights that operated without fuel and walls that had been standing since before living memory. He described, in the plain language of a child, a level of technological and architectural sophistication that is not supposed to have existed anywhere in North America before the arrival of Europeans. And the physical evidence supports him. The stone roads are real. The foundations are real. The earthworks are real. The star forts are real. The buried ground floors of buildings in cities across the country are real. None of these things are disputed. What is disputed is their origin, their age, and their meaning. And the dispute always goes in one direction. It always goes toward the explanation that requires no one to rethink the accepted history. It always goes toward natural formation, or colonial engineering, or street-level raising for drainage purposes. It never goes toward the possibility that someone was here before the story says anyone was here, and that someone went to a great deal of trouble to make sure the evidence of their presence was hidden or explained away. The census gaps Coyle found in his county records were not unique either. Researchers who have gone through county records across the Midwest and the South have found the same pattern in dozens of locations. Households that appear in one census and vanish from the next without explanation. Properties that are listed as occupied and then, within a few years, are listed as wilderness. Names that are carefully written and then carefully scratched out, as if someone went back through the records with the specific intention of removing certain people from the count. In some cases, entire townships have been edited out of the record. A county that once had 12 townships on its map now shows 11, with no surviving document explaining when the 12th was removed or why. A state that once had a certain number of counties now has fewer, with the missing counties appearing only in the oldest documents that are often restricted or difficult to access. The pattern is always the same. Something is there, and then it is not there, and no one can explain what happened to it, and the records that should explain it have been altered or destroyed or sealed away in drawers that no one opens. Coyle saw one small piece of this pattern in his county. The distant cousin who found his notebooks saw a larger piece of it across several states. And researchers who have taken up the work in recent years are seeing it on a scale that dwarfs anything Coyle or his cousin could have imagined. The erasure is not local. It is not regional. It is continental. And there are hints that it extends even beyond the borders of North America, that the same process of demolition and record alteration and population removal has occurred on every inhabited continent, in every era of recorded history. The boy called the people behind it the ones in gray. The old woman called the people behind those people the ones who write. And the truth is that it does not matter what you call them. What matters is the mechanism, and the mechanism is simple. It is the same mechanism that every government and every institution and every person who has ever wanted to control a narrative has used since the invention of writing. You control the record. You decide what gets written down. You decide what gets scratched out. You decide what is taught in schools and preached in churches and printed in newspapers. And everything else, the stone and the roads and the lights and the people who built them, you bury, you burn, you scatter, you rename, and you wait for the natural process of forgetting to do the rest. It almost always works. It has worked for centuries. It has worked so well that most people alive today have no idea that the world they inhabit is built on the ruins of something older and larger and more complex than anything they have been taught to expect. They walk over buried foundations every day. They drive on roads that follow paths laid down by people whose names have been erased from every record. They live in cities whose most impressive buildings were not built by the people who claim credit for them, but by someone else, someone who was here first, someone who was removed. But it does not always work. Because the stone is still there. Because the census gaps are still there. Because the letters of the settlers and the notebooks of the surveyors and the accounts of the orphan train riders are still there, buried in archives and attics and the backs of filing cabinets, waiting for someone to pull them out and read them and start asking the questions that the ones who write do not want asked. The boy asked those questions. He asked them in 1915, in a small office in a small town in a small county in Missouri, and the men in gray came and took him away before the questions could spread. But they did not take the notebooks. They did not take Coyle's memory. They did not take the memories of the other men in that room, or the surveyor's word in the margin, or the stone roads under the leaves, or the standing stone in the circular clearing, or the lights that moved through the woods at night. They left pieces behind. They always leave pieces behind. Because the erasure, no matter how thorough, no matter how well funded, no matter how many men in gray coats are sent to carry it out, can never be complete. There is always a boy who runs. There is always a sheriff who writes it down. There is always a stone that is too heavy to carry away and too deep to bury. And there is always someone, maybe a generation later, maybe a century later, who finds the stone and picks it up and turns it over in their hands and says, "This was not made by nature. This was made by someone. Who were they? Where did they go? And why was I never told they were here?" That is the question the boy left behind. It is the question Coyle left behind. It is the question the stone itself asks, sitting there under the leaves in a forest that the official record says has always been empty, waiting for someone to notice that the forest is not empty at all, that it is full of things that should not be there, things that were built by hands that the history books have erased, things that were hidden by men in gray coats who came with papers and made the hiding allowed. The stone does not care about the papers. The stone does not care about the record. The stone remembers what was built, and it remembers who built it, and it will keep remembering long after the papers have crumbled to dust and the men who carried them have been forgotten. All you have to do is find it. All you have to do is look. And here is the part that should keep you awake tonight. Because the boy's story does not end with the orphan trains. It does not end with the buried buildings, or the census gaps, or the star forts, or any of the individual pieces we have been looking at. Those are just the evidence. The boy's story ends with a question about the nature of the world itself, about the thing we call history, about the process by which a civilization decides what it remembers and what it forgets, and who gets to make that decision. Because here is the truth that the boy understood at 10 years old that most adults never grasp in a lifetime. History is not what happened. History is what was written down. And the distance between those two things can be as vast as the distance between stars. What happened is everything, every event, every person, every building, every road, every city, every civilization that has ever existed on this earth. What was written down is a tiny fraction of that, a fraction that has been selected, curated, edited, and in many cases fabricated by people who had the power to decide what the record would say. The boy did not use those words. He was 10. He used the words a 10-year-old would use. He said the men in gray came with papers, and the papers made things aloud. He said the ones who write decided what the world would remember. He said the real history was buried, hidden in the ruins, waiting for someone to dig it up. But he was describing the same thing. He was describing a world in which the truth and the record are two different things, in which the record has been deliberately constructed to hide the truth, and in which the people who constructed the record have the power to enforce it, to punish anyone who contradicts it, to erase anyone who tries to tell a different story. And the mechanism he described, the papers and the men in gray and the quiet, polite, administrative removal of everything that does not fit the approved version, is not something that existed only in 1915. It is not something that stopped when the last orphan train ran or when the last stone road was buried under leaves. It is something that is still happening. It is something that has been refined and improved and made more efficient with every passing generation. The men in gray may not wear gray coats anymore. The papers may not be physical documents anymore. But the process is the same. The decision about what the world will remember and what it will forget is still being made, every day, by people whose names you do not know and whose authority you have never questioned. The boy understood that. He understood it because he had seen it happen to his own people, in his own lifetime, in a place that was supposed to be hidden from the world but was not hidden well enough. He understood that the world he was entering when he walked out of that forest was not the real world. It was the edited world, the curated world, the world that the ones who write had decided to allow. And he asked Coyle to remember, because memory is the one thing the men in gray cannot take. They can take buildings. They can take people. They can take records and names and entire civilizations. But they cannot take a memory that has been passed from one person to another, spoken aloud, written down in a notebook and locked in a drawer and kept safe until someone finds it and reads it and says, "This matters. This happened. This should not be forgotten." Coyle remembered. The distant cousin remembered. And now you remember too. You have the story in your mind, the same story the boy told in that office in 1915, the same story the old woman told him before she went out to meet the wagons, the same story that has been passed along, hand to hand, memory to memory, for 100 years, surviving every attempt to silence it. The men in gray are still out there. The ones who write are still writing. The world is still being edited, curated, managed, shaped into a version that serves the interests of people you will never meet. But the stone is still out there too. The memory is still alive. And the question is still waiting to be answered. Who took it down? Where did they take everyone? And what else has been hidden beneath the world you were told was the only one that ever existed? The answer to that question is closer than you think. It is not hiding in some distant archive or sealed government vault or classified facility that ordinary people cannot reach. It is right beneath your feet. It is in the woods behind your house. It is in the foundation of the building you work in. It is in the shape of the road you drive on every morning without ever wondering why it curves the way it does or why it follows a path that no modern engineer would have chosen unless that path was already there when the engineer arrived. The evidence of what was erased is everywhere, woven into the landscape so thoroughly that you cannot separate it from the world you live in. You just have to learn how to see it. And once you learn, once your eyes adjust the way your eyes adjust when you walk from bright sunlight into a dark room, you will never unsee it. You will drive through a town you have driven through 1,000 times, and you will notice for the first time that the courthouse is made of stone blocks so massive that no team of horses could have hauled them, that the windows on the lower floor sit 3 feet below the sidewalk, that the building does not match anything else on the street because it was not built at the same time as everything else on the street. It was their first. Everything else grew up around it like weeds around a monument. You will walk through a forest and you will notice that the ground is not flat the way forest ground should be flat. There are ridges, straight ridges, running through the trees in lines that nature does not make. There are depressions in the shape of rectangles, the kind of depressions that appear when a foundation settles into the earth over centuries. There are stones fitted together beneath the leaf litter, stones that were cut by hands, stones that were placed with intention, stones that have been sitting there waiting to be noticed for longer than anyone alive can calculate. You will look at a map and you will notice that certain roads follow paths that make no sense for the towns they connect, but perfect sense if you imagine an older network, a network that connected places that no longer exist, places that were taken down and carried away and buried so thoroughly that the roads are the only evidence they were ever there. You will pull a census record and you will find the scratched out names, the vanished households, the townships that appear on one document and not on the next. You will hold in your hands the same kind of evidence that Coyle held in his hands in that small office in Missouri, and you will feel the same cold recognition that he felt, the recognition that the world is not what you were told it was. And the question you will ask yourself is the same question Coyle asked himself on the night he sat at his kitchen table staring at the wall. What do I do with this? What does a person do when they realize that the ground beneath them is not solid, that the history they were taught is not complete, that the world they trusted was constructed by people who had reasons for building it the way they did, reasons that had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with control? Coyle's answer was silence. He locked the notebooks in a drawer and walked away. He resigned his office. He moved his family east. He spent the rest of his life carrying a weight that he could not put down and could not share, the weight of knowing something that the world had decided should not be known. Harlan's answer was flight. He sold the farm and took his family west and started over in a place where the trees did not remind him of what was hiding behind them. The old woman's answer was sacrifice. She sent the boys south and went out to meet the wagons and accepted whatever came next because she believed that one living memory was worth more than her own survival. The boy's answer was the bravest of all. He talked. He broke the one rule he had been given, the one rule that might have kept him safe, and he told the truth to a stranger because he believed that the truth mattered more than his safety. He was 10 years old, and he understood something that most people never understand no matter how long they live. He understood that silence is how they win. Silence is the tool. Silence is the weapon. The men in gray did not need armies. They did not need violence, most of the time. They just needed people to be quiet. They needed people to look at the scratched-out names and shrug. They needed people to walk over the buried foundations and not look down. They needed people to accept the story they were given and never ask what story it had replaced. The boy refused to be silent. And for that, they came for him. 2 men in gray coats, polite, patient, with papers that looked entirely correct, and they took him away in a covered wagon, and he was never seen again. But his words survived. His words lived in Coyle's notebooks, locked in a drawer, carried from house to house, passed from hand to hand across a century, surviving every move and every death and every moment when someone could have thrown them away but chose not to. His words survived because Coyle made a promise, and Coyle kept it. He remembered. He wrote it down. He preserved the one thing the men in gray could not take, the memory of a boy who told the truth about a world that was being erased. And now those words have reached you. Across 100 years, across the full breadth of a continent, through drawers and attics and the hands of people who did not fully understand what they were holding, the boy's story has arrived in your mind. You are now part of the chain. You are now a carrier of the memory that the men in gray tried to extinguish. That is not a small thing. That is the thing the old woman was trying to protect when she told the boy to run. That is the thing the boy was trying to create when he told Coyle to remember. A chain of memory that stretches from the past into the future, that cannot be broken by papers or wagons or men in coats of any color, that lives in the minds of people who hear the story and refuse to forget it. Think about every civilization you were taught about in school. Think about the neat timelines and the clean narratives and the way each civilization rises and falls in an orderly sequence, one replacing the next like chapters in a book. Now ask yourself who wrote that book. Ask yourself what was left out. Ask yourself whether the civilizations that fell really fell on their own, or whether some of them were pushed, pulled down by hands that worked in the dark and covered their tracks with dirt and new trees and official-looking documents that said the civilization had never been there at all. The boy did not know the full scope of what he was describing. He was 10. He knew his settlement and the woods around it, and the men in gray who came at night. He did not know that the same thing was happening in Ohio and Kentucky and Wisconsin and across the ocean and across the centuries. He did not know that the old woman's theory about the ones who write was not just a theory, but a description of a process that had been operating for longer than any single civilization's memory could reach. But he knew enough. He knew that his home had been real. He knew that the tall buildings had stood. He knew that the lights had come on at dusk without anyone touching them. He knew that the people who lived there had been ordinary people, not gods, not spirits, just people who had built something beautiful and then been made to disappear. And he knew that the disappearance was the crime, not a natural disaster, not the inevitable decline that all civilizations eventually face. A crime, committed by specific people for specific reasons, carried out with tools and crews and paperwork, and then hidden behind a story that said nothing had ever been there to disappear. That is what Coyle could not live with. Not the existence of the settlement. not the technology or the architecture or any of the wonders the boy described. What Coyle could not live with was the crime. The deliberate, organized, administrative destruction of a people and a place, carried out not by barbarians or invaders, but by men in neat coats with proper documents. Men who thanked you for your cooperation while they loaded your neighbors into wagons and drove them away forever. Coyle had spent 19 years enforcing the law. He believed in the law. He believed that the system of rules and records and accountability that governed his county was, for all its flaws, a force for justice. And then a barefoot boy walked into his office and showed him that the system itself could be turned inside out, that the same tools of documentation and legal authority that were supposed to protect people could be used to erase them, and that once the erasure was official, once it had the right stamps and signatures and seals, there was nothing anyone could do to undo it. The law had been used against the people it was supposed to protect. The record had been used to destroy the truth it was supposed to preserve. And Coyle, the man whose entire identity was built on serving the law and maintaining the record, found that he could no longer serve something that had been so thoroughly corrupted. So he quit. He walked away from the only job he had ever wanted and spent the rest of his life as a clerk in a store, stacking shelves and counting change. A man whose neighbors thought he had simply lost his ambition, but who had actually lost something far more important. He had lost his faith in the world he lived in. But he kept the notebooks. He kept them because of the promise. He kept them because somewhere in the back of his mind, behind the grief and the exhaustion and the quiet terror that never fully went away, he believed that someday someone would find them. Someone would read them. Someone would understand what the boy had been trying to say. And here we are, 100 years later, reading the notebooks, hearing the story, sitting with the same questions that Coyle sat with on that autumn night in 1915 when the world he thought he knew fell apart around him. The stone is still out there. That is the fact that anchors all of this. The fact that separates this from legend and fairy tale and the kind of campfire story that dissolves in the morning light. The stone is still out there. It is under the leaves and forests that the history books say have always been empty. It is under the foundations of buildings that the history books say were built by settlers. It is under the streets of cities that the history books say sprang up from nothing in a few short decades. You can go and find it. You can drive to the Ozarks and walk into the deep timber and look for the raised stone roads that the surveyor measured in the 1890s. You can walk through the old parts of any American city and look at the ground floor windows sitting below street level. You can visit the star forts and stand inside them and feel the weight of the geometry around you and ask yourself whether a frontier militia really laid out those perfect angles with hand tools and guesswork. You can pull census records and look for the gaps. You can read the letters of settlers and look for the descriptions of things they found but did not build. You can visit the archives where the orphan train records are kept and trace the children backward and see how many of them vanish into that void of undocumented origin, how many of them appear in the system as if from nowhere, with no past, no family, no verifiable point of origin. The evidence is there. It has always been there. The men in gray buried as much of it as they could, but they could not bury all of it, because the earth is too large and the stone is too heavy, and the truth, once spoken, has a way of persisting that no amount of paperwork can fully overcome. The boy knew that. He knew it at 10 years old, sitting on a cot in a sheriff's office, eating bread with both hands, describing a world that was being torn down around him. He knew that the words he spoke would outlast the buildings that were being demolished. He knew that the memory he planted in Coyle's mind would outlast the settlement that the men in gray were erasing. He knew that the story, once told, could not be untold, no matter how many men in gray coats came to collect it. They collected him. They put him in a wagon and they drove him away, and he was gone. But the story stayed. The story is still here. It is in your mind right now. The same story he told in that office. The same words. The same images. The same truth. A city of tall stone buildings and lights that came on at dusk. An old woman who remembered when the world was bigger. Men in gray coats who came with papers and made things aloud. A boy who ran south through the dark and came out of the trees with nothing but a memory and the courage to share it. That memory is yours now. You are the next link in the chain that stretches back through Coyle and the distant cousin and the great nephew and everyone else who held the notebooks and chose not to destroy them. You are the person the boy was talking to when he said remember. Not Coyle. Not the men in the office. You. Because Coyle is gone. The men in the office are gone. The distant cousin is gone. Everyone who held the notebooks before you is gone. But you are here, and the story is in your mind. And the choice is the same choice it has always been. You can put it in a drawer. You can lock it away and walk away and go about your life and tell yourself it was just a story, just a legend, just the ramblings of a frightened child who did not know what he was talking about. That is the easy choice. That is the choice that the men in gray are counting on you to make. That is the choice that keeps the erasure intact, that keeps the buried stones buried, that keeps the scratched out names scratched out, that keeps the world small and manageable and free of questions that do not have comfortable answers. Or you can do what the boy did. You can talk. You can look at the world around you with eyes that are willing to see what has been hidden. You can ask the questions that the record was designed to prevent. You can go and find the stone for yourself, because it is still there, and it is still waiting, and it does not care whether the men in gray want it found or not. The boy walked out of the trees in the autumn of 1915 with no shoes and no name, and a story that 3 grown men refused to write down in full. He was maybe 10 years old. He had run through the dark to escape the men who were erasing his world. He had broken the only rule that might have kept him safe because he believed that the truth was worth more than safety. He was right. The truth is worth more than safety. The truth is worth more than comfort. The truth is worth more than the clean, curated, officially approved version of the world that you were handed at birth and told never to question. The boy questioned it. Coyle questioned it. The distant cousin questioned it. And now the question has reached you, carried across 100 years by the sheer stubborn persistence of a memory that refused to die. Who took it down? Where did they take everyone? What else has been erased? What else is buried beneath the world you think you know? The stone is still out there. Go find it.